Representing PwC, we're an organization that focuses on numbers. So let's start with a few numbers. 1.7 billion, 10 trillion, 3, maybe 2. Why are these numbers important to the next decade of India? It's everything that Mr. Kent just talked about. Potentially in 2033, 1.7 billion people, driving economic growth, potentially an economy contributing $10 trillion to the global economic landscape. And yes, the relativity of that being that it arguably becomes number 2 in the world. As we step back and think about the potential for India, we see an unbelievable upside. And yes, the progress that was just described must continue. So let's talk a little bit about how we see the world in front of us. Despite signs of an economic slowdown, continuing high inflation, the ripple effects of the war in the Ukraine, interest rates, and the like, the outlook for India has never been better, from inside of India and from out. India's CEOs have managed to stay the course, and our own PwC survey, where we survey 4,400 CEOs around the world, talk about the pessimism in the global economy, yet the Indian CEOs see the positives in the India economy, as do the rest of the CEOs around the world. We believe India can not only grow its economy this year, but do so at the fastest levels. And if able to sustain that, it actually does capture this next decade. Let's remind ourselves that India is already an economic powerhouse, achieving one of the highest growth rates in the past 2 decades. The reality is, how does it actually serve the world and play a world role on a going forward basis? That same CEO survey that I spoke of comes up with another data point. 40+% of the CEOs around the world think their businesses will not be economically viable over the next decade unless they drive significant disruptive change to their organizations. Why do I go there? It's the same for countries. The reality is the uncertainty, the challenges, the disruptions in front of us are coming faster and faster, having bigger and bigger impact. And as a result, we're not only looking at what companies can do, but rather what countries can do. India, in this case, has to transition and continue the transition from the informal economy to a services economy, an economy with advanced manufacturing and leveraging that tech that was just talked about, and a knowledge-led hub, positioning itself to take full advantage of the world's increasing demands, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The population, expected to overtake China relatively soon, is making India the most populous on the planet, and it represents one of the greatest economic opportunities if it can harness the creation, the innovation, and the leverageability of the citizens of this country. If India can navigate these challenges, it not only can survive and thrive, but actually be a model to the rest of the world around inclusive, sustainable growth inside this country and for the benefit of the world. As you step back and think about what's possible, just look at Terminal 2 at the Bangalore airport. Made mostly of renewable materials, entirely run on green energy, it's admirably sustainable. The terminal is packed with high-tech technology, including biometric security and the like, and it was built by a diverse team, including female executives and young apprentices. And the terminal will end up being a service center, a convening point, and a logistical hub for 25 million people a year. Thinking about it as bringing the entree into the Silicon Valley of India. But as I said, the country needs to sustain and thrive, needs to disrupt itself and do even more. So what are the things that we see in terms of the changes, the focus, and the areas of emphasis that the country, its leadership team, and the business community and our community leaders must be focused on? There are 5. First, size and take advantage of the green revolution. The transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy is going to include a rewiring of the global economy in new and different ways that we've never thought of. India is at the forefront of this transition, as was just described. The national hydrogen mission that was described is just a great example of that. And India is making moves to transition its own economy to a low carbon-based model, supporting its green initiatives and industries while positioning itself to take advantage of the needs of the world in front of us. For example, even though it still relies on oil and coal, India now is the world's 3rd largest producer of renewable energy, sourcing 40% of its electricity through renewables. That's beneficial to India as well as the supply chains that are sourced from India. But let's remind ourselves, India has to deal with a challenge in front of it, which is not only focusing on the mitigation of emissions and being cleaner, but also adaptation. As you see yourselves as a country being perhaps in the risk of threat by flood, droughts, and other aspects. And equal capital has to flow to adaptation as opposed to just mitigation. This is going to be important in terms of not leaving anyone behind. Adaptation doesn't mean running away from a city or a location. Rather, it means staying, dealing with and enabling better the citizens of those places that most might be at threat. Let's jump to the second thing, as was described just a few minutes ago, being a leader in tech. We're pleased to see Prime Minister Modi herald the decade of the 2020s be India's technological decade. I'm going to argue it's not India's technology decade, it's actually the world, of which India has a major and perhaps leading role to play. We know India is a leader in digital transformation, as was described, processing as many digital payments in this country alone as Visa does on a global basis at any given point in time. And as was described, you're already rolling out biometric techniques to deal with and accelerate the changes in terms of how to deal with finance, healthcare, education, and other aspects like this. It's this kind of innovation, this kind of boldness that can make India even a bigger tech contender in the coming years. And they need to make the most of its young, digitally savage population, rapidly exploring and expanding that connectivity for purposes of innovation. And we see a huge opportunity to do that. That technology, that climate and going greener leads to the third point, which is developing the sectors of tomorrow. It's clear that you're making the right moves as a country to grow and ensure that you're actually at the higher end of manufacturing, while actually transforming yourselves to be more focused on services with equal prominence. The government's continued focus of building the infrastructure to support this and making the infrastructure easier to do business is going to be significantly important to convince those outside of the world to actually invest, grow, and leverage what's happening inside of India itself. The recent CapEx push is driving a self-reliant India initiative, and it's going to achieve a number of sustainable goals that India has outlined, but will also enable the achievement of the sustainability goals that the UN had poured forth previously. The only way this happens, though, is more focus on public-private partnerships, coming together to get the needed capital and the capitalism in place to drive the change at a pace commensurate with the opportunity. This is going to be important to ensure that India is well positioned to necessarily drive the change inside, but also drive the attractiveness of companies from the outside to want to come in and diversify their supply chains. Let me be very clear. This door is now open. As you look at what's happened in the geopolitical world, India now becomes a much bigger opportunity in terms of global supply chain optionality and diversification. But it needs to overcome the potential barriers. Those barriers will include other governments and countries incenting behavior back to the homeland. It will necessarily have to overcome and overachieve in terms of where China, coming out of its COVID threat, will now actually go big as it plays on a worldwide stage once again. And you cannot underestimate the China government in helping support this happen. As a result, India needs to actually think about redesigning supply chain for the use of others, being economically feasible, resilient and secure, be scalable up and down, no matter what the economic certainty may be leveraging labor and data like never before, and yes, be greener, and ensure that the greener is trusted, understood, and benefit for those upstream. This opportunity is tremendous as we look at the decade ahead. In order to do this, gets to the fourth point, building the skills necessary to make this come to life in scale. India's transformation and growth is a direct correlation with the knowledge, skills, and talent of the citizens that it has. This in turn is dependent on the public and private partnerships and investments around education, skill building, credentialing, and building a much more knowledge-based economy. For India, prioritizing investments in each of the education subsystems is not an option. It is an imperative. And upskilling people across this nation is needed, not only to ensure the skills necessary to continue employment, but rather to bring those that are unemployed or looking to be future employed to the table to be fit for purpose going forward. We're pleased to see the Prime Minister's focus and a higher focus through the budgets that have been set in this area, both in terms of quality education, enhancement of the teachers and what they're able to achieve, and yes, incenting people to want into that training. The policies and procedures are going to be important to make it happen. And this can't be done just by itself with government at the federal or state level. Private enterprises have to help, and they need to sustain the supply chain of education on a continuous basis. Because once leaving the formal education system, learning doesn't stop. And a lifetime of learning is going to be needed as you think about the youth, the more tenured, and yes, the elderly are going to need the opportunity for personal prosperity. In our case at PwC, we're working with, for example, UNICEF and Generation Unlimited to actually ensure not only the skills and an appropriate supply of labor, but also the entrepreneurship and the scaling of entrepreneurship to create the demand for that labor. As we step back, you can have as much labor as you possibly can want. If there are no jobs to go to, and they're in other parts of the world, those citizens lose. So Gen U, PwC, UNICEF, and other organizations like that are working with your government and at the local and federal level to ensure connectivity, the use of technology, to access that education. Ensure that we've got quality courses and certification opportunities and broader education potential. But yes, we are also looking to ensure the entrepreneurship, dealing with the demand side, and yes, inclusively bring youth to the table more so, since they are the ones that both benefit from the opportunity as well as will drive the change needed to capture the opportunity. Which leads to the last point. How does the country continue to harness the power of young people and women? By 2030, India is projected to have the largest working age population on the planet. This is great if those people can find jobs. India will see a huge demographic dividend from it, speedy economic growth commensurate with that labor force change, and millions of people entering the labor force. And as a result, enabling their own consumption at a higher level, thereby enabling economic growth at the communities at the larger state and federal level, continuing the cycle for economic development. It's clear that the centers of excellence the government is putting in place is going to help, but more has to be done. More has to be done to ensure that women are an important engine for that future growth. And this is where culturally, systemically, as well as consistently around the country, more needs to be done. Currently, 20% of the women in this country are in the workforce. That number needs to increase significantly as you look at the opportunity for both labor participation, more consumption, and the inevitable circularity of what's ongoing. Yes, the union budget has actually focused on this, but not at the pace of change necessary to be commensurate with the opportunity over the next decade. As I started, 1.7 billion people, $10 trillion of GDP, contributing 10% of the world's GDP, is the opportunity for India. As you step back, these 5 springboards, focusing on green, leveraging technology, enabling scalability of the sectors and new sectors to be developed, by therefore enabling new and different skill sets to be leveraged and bringing youth and women into the agenda, are the key ingredients to success for India over the next decade, ultimately achieving, if not outperforming, the expectation of those numbers that I just described. When I arrived in India, both in December, when I came here to visit previously, as well as yesterday, I had 3 observations. First, India, as a country, does have the opportunity to make this world its focus for the next decade. In doing so, it has to actually enable a better brand recognition outside of this country, far eclipsing what people perceive it to be today, and what needs to be focused on is not on what it was in the past, but what it is today and what it can be tomorrow. That marketing, that advertising, that experience has got to be cascaded for the rest of the world to want to come here more so. Clearly the need for focus on infrastructure, ease of doing business, rule of law and the like needs to continue. You are making progress in those areas and the world needs to know more so of it. Second, even though you are actually delivering marketing and advertising to bring the world here, as evidenced by the World Economic Forum a few weeks ago, where the contingency from India was over the top and noticed by everybody, it is far more than marketing. Third, let's make sure that we're focused on the domestic agenda to serve well those 1.7 and leverage it for the economic growth that's needed. I started with the macro picture, CEOs from around the world. Let me describe what those CEOs see over the next decade. A thriving economy that is needed to be served. They see and need more labor with technology skills to change its own business models. And technology changes that are going to far eclipse anything we've ever seen before. As you think about data, AI, quantum computing, and the disruption of normal changes. The world cannot source them in their own countries. They will come to India to take advantage of that. If India can do the 5 things I talked about, India thrives and becomes the model for the world, leading the world. Folks, you should not be thinking about India as the emerging market. India is the leading market. The decade is yours to capture. Take advantage of it, and let's move forward as fast as we can. Thank you very much.